What happens when a beloved hairstylist sits down for what should be a simple chat about creativity and celebrity styling, only to be attacked, belittled, and humiliated on live television by a host who clearly woke up on the wrong side of fame? It only took 33 seconds of Lorraine Kelly speaking before the entire interview spiraled into one of the most shocking moments in daytime television history. Chris Appleton walked onto that set with a smile. He came ready to talk about his work, his passion, his journey in the beauty industry. He's styled some of the biggest names in entertainment. He's built a career on making people feel beautiful. And he showed up that morning expecting a conversation. What he got instead was an ambush. The studio lights were bright as always. The audience sat waiting. Lorraine Kelly took her seat across from Chris with that signature smile she's known for. But something was different. But you could feel it in the air. The energy was off from the very beginning. "So, Chris," Lorraine started, leaning back in her chair like she owned not just the show, but the entire building. "You've made quite a name for yourself doing hair for famous people. Must be nice playing dress up for a living." Playing dress up. Those were her actual words. Chris's smile faltered for just a second, but he recovered quickly. He's a professional. He's dealt with difficult personalities before. "Well, I wouldn't call it playing dress up," Chris said, keeping his tone light and friendly. "It's actually a craft that takes years to perfect. I've trained extensively and worked incredibly hard to get where I am." Lorraine waved her hand dismissively, like she was swatting away a fly. The panel members sitting beside her, including regulars Andy Peters and fashion expert Mark Hayes, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They could sense where this was heading. "Oh. Come on," Lorraine said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You're not exactly curing cancer, are you? You put some spray in people's hair and call it art." The audience went quiet. Dead silent. This wasn't playful banter. This was an attack. And it was happening on live television. Chris sat up straighter. His jaw tightened. But still, he kept his composure. "Actually, Lorraine, what I do is help people feel confident. I help them feel beautiful. And if you think that's not important, then I'm not sure you understand the impact that self-esteem has on people's lives." "Self-esteem," Lorraine repeated, mocking his tone. "How noble of you. Tell me, how much do you charge for all this confidence boosting? Because from what I hear, your prices are absolutely ridiculous." Andy Peters jumped in, trying to save the situation. "Lorraine, I think what Chris does is actually really impressive. The technical skill alone is—" "Nobody asked you, Andy," Lorraine snapped, not even looking at him. Her eyes stayed locked on Chris. "I'm talking to our guest about his little hobby here." Little hobby. The disrespect was staggering. Mark Hayes looked down at his notes, clearly embarrassed to be part of this panel. This was supposed to be a feel-good morning show. This was supposed to be light entertainment. Instead, it was turning into a public execution. Chris took a deep breath. You could see him making a choice in real time. He could either let this go and try to salvage the interview, smile through the pain, pretend like her words didn't cut deep, or he could stand up for himself. He could defend not just his own dignity, but the dignity of everyone who'd ever been dismissed for their profession. Everyone who'd ever been told their passion wasn't important. Everyone who'd ever been made to feel small by someone in power. He chose the latter. And in that moment, everything changed. "Lorraine, I came here today as a guest on your show. I came here to have a conversation, not to be insulted. I came here in good faith, expecting to be treated with the same respect I would show you. What you're doing right now is incredibly unprofessional and honestly quite cruel. You're using your platform, your position of power, to belittle someone who can't fight back on equal terms. Except I can fight back. And I am." The audience gasped. "You don't talk back to Lorraine Kelly. Not on her own show. Not in her domain. but Chris had every right to defend himself. Lorraine's face changed. The fake smile disappeared completely. Now it was just cold, hard arrogance. Cruel? You think I'm being cruel? I'm simply asking you to justify why anyone should care about what you do. You're a hairdresser, Chris. You're not special. Actually, Mark Hayes interjected, finding his courage. Chris is one of the most respected professionals in his field. He's worked with... Mark, please, Lorraine interrupted again, her voice sharp as a knife. Let the man defend himself if he can. If he can. The implication was clear. She didn't think he could. She thought she could break him down on her show in front of her audience, and he would just take it. Chris stood up. Not quickly, not dramatically, just calmly, purposefully stood up from his chair. The cameras kept rolling. The producers in the control room were probably losing their minds, but nobody stopped him. You know what, Lorraine, Chris said, his voice steady and strong. I've sat across from some of the most powerful people in entertainment. I've worked under pressure that would make your morning show look like a kindergarten class. And not once, not ever, has anyone spoken to me the way you're speaking to me right now. Lorraine laughed. Actually laughed, like this was all some big joke. Oh, please, don't be so sensitive. This is just a conversation. No, Chris said firmly. This isn't a conversation. A conversation requires respect. What you're doing is trying to tear me down for your own entertainment, and I won't sit here and let you do it. Andy Peters nodded slightly, clearly agreeing with Chris, but not brave enough to say it out loud. The audience was completely transfixed. This was not what they signed up for when they came to watch a daytime talk show. So what are you going to do? Lorraine challenged, leaning forward in her chair. Are you going to storm off my set like a child throwing a tantrum? I'm going to leave, Chris said calmly, because I have too much self-respect to sit here and be your punching bag. You invited me here as a guest, and you've treated me like garbage from the moment I sat down. Oh, here we go, Lorraine said, rolling her eyes dramatically. The victim card. How original. Mark Hayes finally spoke up with real conviction. Lorraine, he's right. You've been completely out of line this entire interview. I don't know what's gotten into you, but this isn't okay. Lorraine spun on Mark like a viper. Excuse me? This is my show, Mark. Mine. I can run it however I want. If Chris here can't handle a few tough questions, then maybe he shouldn't be in the public eye. Tough questions? Chris repeated, his voice rising for the first time. You haven't asked me a single legitimate question. You've just insulted my profession, mocked my work, and dismissed everything I've accomplished. That's not tough questioning. That's just being nasty. The audience started murmuring among themselves. Some people were nodding in agreement with Chris. Others looked shocked that this was happening at all. The energy in the studio had shifted completely. This was no longer Lorraine's show. This was Chris's moment. I've been nothing but nasty, Lorraine said, her voice getting louder. I'm simply refusing to treat you like you're some kind of celebrity when all you do is fix hair. Get over yourself. And what do you do, Lorraine? Chris shot back. You sit in a chair and talk to people. By your logic, that's not exactly groundbreaking either, is it? The audience actually gasped out loud this time. Andy Peters put his hand over his mouth. Mark Hayes looked like he wanted to applaud, but knew he couldn't. Nobody spoke to Lorraine Kelly like that. Not on her own show. Lorraine's face turned red. Actually red. How dare you? I have built a career spanning decades. I am a respected journalist and broadcaster. You are a hairdresser who got lucky with some celebrity clients. Got lucky? Chris repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. I've worked since I was a teenager to perfect my craft. I've studied. I've practiced. I've dedicated my entire life to this. And you're going to sit there and tell me I got lucky? Yes, Lorraine said bluntly. Because let's be honest, Chris, without those celebrities, nobody would know who you are. You're famous by association. You're a +1. The cruelty of that statement hung in the air like poison. Andy Peters actually flinched. Mark Hayes looked genuinely angry now, but Lorraine just sat there with a satisfied smirk on her face, in like she'd just delivered the killing blow. Chris took a moment. He breathed. He composed himself, and when he spoke again, his voice was calm, but filled with power. You know what the saddest part of all this is? I actually used to respect you. I grew up watching you on television. I thought you were someone who lifted people up. I thought you celebrated talent and hard work. But sitting here right now, I see someone who's become so bitter and so entitled that you can't even treat a guest with basic human decency. Lorraine's smirk faded. That one landed. That one actually hurt her. You could see it in her eyes. For just a moment, the mask slipped completely, and there was something almost vulnerable there. But it was quickly replaced by anger. You don't know anything about me, Lorraine said, her voice defensive now. You have no idea what it takes to maintain a career at this level for as long as I have. That may be true, Chris replied calmly, but I know enough to recognize cruelty when I see it. And I know enough to recognize someone who's forgotten why they got into this business in the first place. The words hung in the air like an accusation, because that's exactly what they were. An accusation that Lorraine had lost her way, that fame and success had corrupted her. That the woman on television now bore little resemblance to the woman who had started out decades ago with genuine warmth and curiosity. I know that you've used the last 10 minutes to try and humiliate me on live television, Chris said. I know that you've dismissed my entire career as worthless. I know that you've been rude, condescending, and deliberately hurtful, and I know that I'm done with this interview. He started to walk away from his chair. The camera operators didn't know where to point their lenses. The producers were screaming into headsets. This was chaos. If you walk off this set, you'll never work in British television again, Lorraine threatened, standing up from her own chair now. Her face was flushed, her composure completely shattered. I have influence, Chris. I can make sure of that. One phone call, and every producer, every network, every show will know what kind of person you really are. The threat was clear. The implication was unmistakable. She was threatening his career, his livelihood, all because he dared to stand up to her bullying. Chris stopped, turned around, and smiled. Not a fake smile, a real one. Because he just won. Because in making that threat, Lorraine had revealed everything anyone needed to know about her. Is that supposed to scare me? Chris asked, his voice steady and clear. You're going to blacklist me because I won't sit here and let you abuse me? You're going to use your power and your connections to punish me for having self-respect? Go ahead. Do your worst. But just know that everyone watching this right now, everyone in this audience, everyone at home, they all just saw who you really are. And no amount of influence can change that. Andy Peters actually whispered, "Wow," under his breath. Mark Hayes had his arms crossed, nodding in agreement with every word Chris said. Even some of the camera operators were struggling to maintain their professional neutrality, their faces showing clear support for the hairstylist who was dismantling their boss on live television. The audience actually started clapping. Not everyone, not the whole room, but enough people that it was unmistakable. They were clapping for Chris. They were supporting him, and Lorraine knew it. You could see the realization dawning on her face. She'd lost control. She'd lost the room. She'd lost everything. An older woman in the third row was clapping enthusiastically, nodding her head with obvious approval. A young couple near the front exchanged glances and then joined in the applause. A man in his 50s who'd been sitting with his arms crossed. The entire interview uncrossed them just to clap. This wasn't planned. This wasn't coordinated. This was genuine, spontaneous support for someone who'd been treated terribly. "Stop that," Lorraine snapped at the audience. Her voice shrill now, all pretense of control gone. "Stop clapping right now. This is completely inappropriate. But they didn't stop. If anything, more people joined in. The sound grew louder, more confident. What had started as a few scattered claps had become a wave of support that filled the entire studio. Andy Peters was trying not to smile. Mark Hayes had given up trying to hide his approval and was openly nodding along. "This is my show!" Lorraine shouted over the applause. "My show! You don't clap for someone who disrespects me on my own program." "They're not clapping because I disrespected you," Chris said quietly, but his voice carried across the studio. "They're clapping because I stood up for myself. Because I refused to be your victim. And deep down, you know that what you did today was wrong." Lorraine looked around the studio like she was seeing it for the first time. Her own panel members wouldn't make eye contact with her. Her audience was clapping for the guest she'd tried to destroy. Her show, her domain, had turned against her. "Get him out of here," Lorraine said to the stage managers. "Get him off my set right now." "I'm already leaving," Chris said, holding up his hands. "You don't have to throw me out. I'm choosing to go. There's a difference." He walked toward the exit with his head held high. The applause grew louder. Some people were even standing now. This was unprecedented. "You're nothing without those celebrities," Lorraine yelled after him, losing all composure now. "You hear me? Nothing." Chris stopped one more time at the edge of the stage. He looked back at Lorraine, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with pity. "And you're nothing without this show. So maybe we're not so different after all. The only difference is I treat people with respect." And with that, he walked off. The studio erupted. People were talking, shouting, clapping. Andy Peters was staring at Lorraine like he didn't recognize her. Mark Hayes was shaking his head in disbelief. Lorraine stood there in the middle of her own set, surrounded by cameras and lights and an audience that had just witnessed her complete and total loss of control. She'd invited Chris Appleton onto her show, thinking she could make herself look bigger by making him look small. Instead, she'd revealed exactly who she was, and there was no coming back from that. "We're going to take a quick break," Lorraine finally said, her voice shaking slightly. "When we come back, we'll have our cooking segment." But nobody was thinking about cooking. Nobody was thinking about anything except what they'd just seen. A host who had forgotten that her guests were human beings. A professional who had weaponized her platform to stroke her own ego. And a hairstylist who had reminded everyone that talent, respect, and dignity matter more than fame. The cameras cut away. The lights dimmed slightly. But the damage was done. Lorraine Kelly had shown the world who she really was. And Chris Appleton had shown everyone who he was too. A man with integrity. A man who knew his worth. A man who refused to be diminished, no matter how big the stage or how bright the lights. As the stage crew scrambled to reset for the next segment, Andy Peters leaned over to Mark Hayes and whispered something. Mark nodded in agreement. They both knew what had just happened. They'd just witnessed a moment that would be talked about for years. Not because of the shouting or the drama, but because of what it represented. One person trying to use their power to hurt another, and that other person refusing to be hurt. Backstage, Chris Appleton gathered his things. His hands weren't shaking. His breathing was steady. He'd done nothing wrong. He'd simply stood up for himself. And if that meant he'd never be invited back onto Lorraine Kelly's show, then so be it. Some things are more important than television appearances. Back in the studio, Lorraine sat in her chair during the commercial break, surrounded by assistants and producers. They were all talking at once, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. But there was no salvaging this. The interview had aired live. People had seen it. The internet was probably already exploding with clips and reactions. "It wasn't that bad, was it?" Lorraine asked her producer, but even she didn't sound convinced. The producer didn't answer. They didn't have to. Lorraine knew. She'd crossed a line. She'd let her ego and her sense of entitlement override her professionalism, and she'd done it in front of millions of people. When the show came back from commercial, Lorraine tried to carry on like nothing had happened. She smiled, she laughed. She introduced the cooking segment with all the enthusiasm she could muster, but everyone watching could see through it. Everyone knew what had just transpired. The cooking guest, a local chef who'd been waiting in the wings, came out and started preparing a dish. Lorraine asked questions and made comments, but her heart wasn't in it. How could it be? She'd just had one of the worst moments of her career broadcast live to the nation. Andy Peters and Mark Hayes tried their best to support the cooking segment, jumping in with comments and jokes when appropriate. But even they seemed subdued. The energy had been sucked out of the studio. What should have been a fun, lighthearted morning show had turned into something much darker. As the chef whisked eggs and chopped vegetables, Lorraine's mind was clearly elsewhere. She kept glancing at the spot where Chris had been sitting. The empty chair seemed to mock her, a physical reminder of her failure. "So, Lorraine," the chef said cheerfully, oblivious to the tension, "would you like to try stirring this?" Lorraine took the spoon mechanically and stirred the pot on the portable stove. She smiled for the cameras. She made appropriate noises about how good it smelled. But inside, she was spiraling. Andy Peters leaned toward Mark Hayes during a camera transition and whispered loud enough for nearby microphones to catch. "That was absolutely mental. I've never seen anything like that in all my years here." Mark nodded grimly. "She went way too far. Way too far. That poor man came here in good faith." Their conversation was quickly hushed by a producer, but the damage was done. Even her own panelists were questioning her behavior. Even the people who sat beside her every single day couldn't defend what had just happened. Meanwhile, the chef continued his demonstration, just completely unaware that he was performing for an audience that wasn't really watching. How could they watch a cooking segment when they'd just witnessed a verbal assassination attempt? How could they care about recipes when they'd seen someone fight for their dignity on live television? Lorraine tried to focus on the chef's instructions. She tried to ask relevant questions. "And how long does this need to simmer?" she asked, her voice lacking its usual energy. "Mom, about 15 minutes, the chef replied enthusiastically. "You'll know it's ready when the sauce thickens, and you can see it coating the back of the spoon." 15 minutes. The same amount of time that had passed during the Chris Appleton interview. The same amount of time it had taken for Lorraine to completely destroy her credibility. 15 minutes that would define her career from this point forward. The audience sat quietly, so politely watching the cooking demonstration, but clearly distracted. You could see it in their faces. They were still processing what had happened, still trying to understand how a simple interview had escalated into such a confrontation, still wondering if they'd actually seen what they thought they'd seen, because it was shocking. It truly was. Lorraine Kelly, beloved morning television host, had revealed a side of herself that most people never knew existed. The warmth was gone. The friendliness was gone. In its place was something cold and calculating and cruel. "This looks absolutely delicious," Lorraine said to the chef, forcing enthusiasm into her voice. "I'm sure our viewers at home will love making this." But would they? Would anyone watching at home be able to focus on the recipe after what they'd just witnessed? Or would they be too busy talking about the interview, sharing clips on social media, discussing whether Lorraine had finally shown her true colors? The cooking segment ended. The chef thanked Lorraine and the panel. Applause from the audience was tepid at best, and then came the final segment before the show's close. The show continued. More segments, more guests, a fashion feature, a news update, all the regular components of a morning talk show. But nothing could erase what had happened. Nothing could undo those 15 minutes of television that had revealed the real Lorraine Kelly. In the audience, people whispered to each other. They'd come expecting a pleasant morning of entertainment. Instead, they'd witnessed something raw and uncomfortable. They'd seen a powerful person abuse that power, and they'd seen someone brave enough to walk away from it. Chris Appleton was long gone by now, probably in a car heading back to his studio or his home, probably processing what had just happened. But he'd left behind something important. He'd left behind proof that you don't have to accept mistreatment, even from someone famous, even on live television, even when walking away might cost you opportunities. As the show wound down toward its closing segment, Lorraine tried one last time to reclaim her authority. She smiled at the camera and said, "Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you tomorrow with more great guests and exciting features." But her words rang hollow, because everyone knew that tomorrow the conversation wouldn't be about whatever guests she had lined up. The conversation would be about today, about Chris Appleton, about the interview that went catastrophically wrong, about the host who forgot that her job was to make guests feel welcome, not to tear them down. The credits rolled. The theme music played. The cameras pulled back to show the studio one last time. Lorraine waved to the audience, that practiced television smile plastered on her face. But it was over. The show was over. And in more ways than one, something else was over too. Her reputation as the friendly, warm host of morning television had taken a serious hit. Maybe it could be repaired, maybe with time and genuine apologies and changed behavior. But the damage was done. The mask had slipped. And once people see who you really are, it's very hard to convince them they didn't. As the studio lights came up fully and the audience began to file out, there was an unusual quiet. Normally, people leave these tapings chatting excitedly about what they'd seen, happy to have been part of a television show. But today, they left with furrowed brows and concerned expressions. They'd witnessed something they couldn't quite process yet. Backstage, the production team was already in crisis mode. Phone calls were being made. Emails were being sent. Damage control was underway. But you can't control damage that's already been broadcast live. You can't unsay things that millions of people heard. You can't undo cruelty that was displayed for all to see. And somewhere across town, Chris Appleton was probably getting calls and messages from friends and colleagues who'd watched the interview. People checking in, people expressing outrage on his behalf. Some people telling him how proud they were that he stood up for himself. Because that's what this moment would ultimately be remembered for. Not as the time Chris Appleton got kicked off a show, but as the time Chris Appleton refused to be diminished. The time he chose dignity over diplomacy. The time he reminded everyone watching that respect is not optional, it's essential. Lorraine Kelly had started that interview thinking she was in control. She had the home field advantage. She had the panel on her side. She had the audience in her studio. She had everything going for her. But she'd forgotten the most important thing. She'd forgotten that power without empathy is just cruelty. And cruelty, eventually, always costs you more than it gains. The show was over. The cameras were off. The audience had left. But the impact of what happened would reverberate far beyond that studio. It would be discussed online. It would be analyzed by media critics. It would become a case study in how not to treat your guests. And through it all, one truth remained crystal clear. Chris Appleton had come to that show as a guest. He'd left as something more. A reminder that self-respect matters. That standing up for yourself is not the same as being difficult. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away. Lorraine Kelly had tried to make him feel small. Instead, she'd made him look bigger than ever. And she'd made herself look exactly like what she'd become. Entitled, dismissive, mean, the kind of person who uses their platform as a weapon instead of a gift. In the end, the interview that was supposed to be a simple chat about hairstyling and celebrity culture became something much more significant. It became a moment of truth, a moment where masks fell away and real character was revealed. And when that happened, there could only be one person standing tall. It wasn't the host with the decades-long career and the famous name. It was the hairstylist who knew his worth.